Due to the fact that our planet faces serious environmental issues and nearly all scientific evidence points to humans as the main driver of these problems, our societies have begun to ask individuals what they can do to help the environment. In this video, we will explore what scientists around the world have called the best behavior change that an individual can make to reduce his or her carbon footprint. That behavior change is eating less meat. We'll discuss how the current meat industry is a major environmental issue, mainly because of its large and inefficient use of energy and resources. The U.S. beef cattle industry supplies approximately 11.3 billion kilograms of beef annually and represents a $35 billion industry. Depending on the time of year, 11 to 17 million steers are housed in commercial feedlots in the United States alone. As you can imagine, raising so many cows requires massive amounts of land. In fact, livestock graze 1/4 of the world's surface, or the equivalent to a landmass larger than the entire continent of Africa. Unfortunately, the land upon which cattle graze is replacing valuable land, such as forests, across the globe. Trees are cut and land is converted into pastures for cattle grazing. The Amazon rainforest faces severe deforestation. Some reports estimate that up to 70% of deforestation in the Amazon can be attributed to cattle ranching. The loss of such vast areas of forest, both in the Amazon and in other places, is devastating to our planet because trees are natural carbon sinks. A carbon sink is something that absorbs more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than it releases. As carbon sinks, the forests and trees are able to absorb the carbon dioxide produced by the burning of fossil fuels. Industries like the meat industry that remove carbon sinks while contributing to the use of carbon-intensive energy sources creates a positive feedback loop with regards to climate change. As the land becomes less productive and as the symptoms of climate change threaten the planet and its inhabitants, it calls for more use of energy to maintain our lifestyles and consumption and production levels. The degradation of land requires the use of significant amounts of synthetic fertilizers, which requires a lot of energy to be produced. As the soil is eroded by the animals in feedlots, more synthetic fertilizer and in turn more energy must be used to maintain the desired production. The natural resources and functions of the land could help mitigate climate change and its consequences, yet we destroy these natural services and are forced to put even more energy into the systems in order to make up for our destruction. Meat is also one of the most inefficient foods from an energy standpoint. It takes enormous amounts of energy to produce meat in comparison to the caloric energy that a consumer gets from the meat. In other words, producers put a lot of energy in, and consumers get very little energy out of the meat. The energy being put into the meat production system could be used in significantly better ways. As shown in a typical food web, the amount of energy provided to a secondary consumer is significantly less than the amount of energy being provided to the primary consumer. At each trophic level, 90% of the energy is lost, meaning that the diet of a secondary consumer is 90% less efficient than that of a primary consumer. According to Princeton bioethicist Peter Singer, if the grain used for meat production were fed to the 1.4 billion people who are currently living in poverty, we could provide each person with half a ton of grain each year, or 3 pounds a day, twice the amount needed for survival. If all grain currently fed to livestock in the United States were consumed directly by people, the number of people who could be fed would be nearly 800 million. In addition to the vast amounts of resources being exploited to the meat industry, the agricultural sector is also responsible for 22% of global greenhouse gas emissions, with livestock production accounting for 80% of the sector's emissions. Meat consumption creates a multiplier effect where each kilogram of meat produced requires the use of many resources, since more plant proteins are being used to raise livestock rather than being used to feed the growing world population. In addition to grain use, the production of meat also requires the use of fossil fuels to harvest the grains and then transport and process the meat. Each year, the average American citizen consumes 124 kilograms of meat, and with a population of over 316 million people, the annual demand for meat in the United States is a staggering 38.4 billion kilograms. Producers are only one half of the supply and demand of the meat industry. Consumer demand has a huge impact on the level of meat production. The classic Western diet consists of high amounts of meat and other animal products. If it weren't problematic enough that developed nations have such meat-intensive diets, the developing nations like China and India are now adopting these diets and therefore increasing the global meat demand. Fulfilling that demand would have serious consequences for climate change and energy supply. The most significant barrier to convincing consumers to eat less meat in order to use less energy is the behavior impact gap problem. Simply put, consumers do not understand the connections between their individual choices and their impact on the environment. As a result, they consume too much meat, perpetuating this industry that uses vast amounts of energy and destroys our environment. The consumer's price does not reflect the actual cost of the product, including its inefficient use of energy and contribution to climate change, so they consume too much and keep the meat industry producing too much and using too much energy. Another factor is lack of salience. Imagine a piece of steak. Upon looking at the steak, do you see the fuel used to transport it, the energy used to process it, the water and grain used to nourish the cow, the trees cut to make a feedlot for the cow, or the water, energy, and land to grow grain for the cow? Of course not. The consumer sees taste and aesthetics. These qualities are much easier to see and therefore are much more salient and important. Once again, consumers eat too much meat, and the meat industry continues to use significant amount of fossil fuel. Individuals do not see the positive consequences of their choice to consume less meat and therefore have little incentive to make that choice. However, experts have already calculated the benefits of an individual eating less meat. A vegetarian's fossil fuel footprint is about 2/3 of the average American's, and a vegan's is even lower. Even just eating chicken instead of beef cuts 1/4 of energy use and emissions in one simple dietary choice. A recent United Nations report concluded that the meat industry causes almost 40% more greenhouse gas emissions because of its use of energy and fossil fuels than all the world's transportation systems. That's all the cars, trucks, planes, and ships in the world combined. As energy continues to be an important issue for the environment, politics, and business, it is incredibly important to look at meat production and consumption as a means for energy reductions, especially in developed countries. Individuals need help making the correct consumption choices either through education, government policies, or other methods because consumer demand is such a significant factor, allowing and even forcing producers to use large amounts of energy to meet that demand. Even though it seems difficult to reduce your meat consumption, if you've ever asked yourself, what can I do as an individual to help our environment? Don't look any farther than your own dinner plate.